Hey everyone, today we're opening the doors of a 1960s school cafeteria, where metal trays clattered against the counter, small milk cartons waited in wire crates and the smell of onions, warm rolls and brown gravy reached the hallway before the lunch bell finished ringing. Among the 30 school foods in this journey, few look. It was plain dependable and arranged with almost architectural confidence. One square or narrow slice of meatloaf, one pale mound of potatoes, one ladle of gravy, and a vegetable confined to its own compartment. To a hungry child it could look like a miniature Sunday dinner. To a suspicious child it looked like several difficult negotiations sharing one tray. Either way the image stayed. Decades later, many people may forget the arithmetic lesson before lunch, but they can still remember exactly how the gravy moved when the tray tilted. If these forgotten American foods, grocery habits, kitchen rules and family traditions bring back a memory, please like the video and subscribe to Forgotten American Home. And tell us in the comments, which school lunch from the 1960s do you remember most clearly? Did your family serve meatloaf and mashed potatoes at home? And did the cafeteria version taste anything like it? For this list, we are including foods that appeared in documented school meal traditions or remain strongly associated with particular districts and regions, not pretending that every child in every state ate the same lunch. A rural school with a small kitchen, a large city system using central preparation, and a suburban building with its own ovens could produce very different trays. Yet the basic problem was shared. Hundreds of children had to be fed quickly, portions had to be predictable, ingredients had to fit a budget, and the food had to survive the journey from mixing bowl to oven, from oven to steam table, and from steam table to a child who'd already decided whether lunch was going to be wonderful or unfair. Meatloaf was well suited to that work because it could turn ground beef crumbs or cereal seasoning liquid and chopped onion into neat portions that held together long enough to reach the table. In a school kitchen, the scale changed everything. This was not one loaf resting in a family pan beside the sink. It might be mixture measured for dozens of servings pressed into pans baked in institutional ovens, cooled just enough to slice, and moved toward the serving line while another worker prepared potatoes and gravy. The cafeteria staff had to think in rows, scoops, pans, and minutes. A home cook could cut one slice thicker for a hungry teenager. A lunch server facing a line of children needed portions that looked reasonably alike. That requirement gave cafeteria meatloaf its familiar geometry. Depending on the school, the top might carry tomato sauce, a light glaze, or nothing more decorative than the browned surface left by the oven. The flavour varied too, sometimes onion heavy, sometimes mild, and sometimes mainly remembered as the part beneath the gravy. Then came the mashed potatoes placed on the tray with a scoop that left a smooth dome or a soft spiral. Some school kitchens prepared potatoes from fresh ingredients, while others used dehydrated products or methods chosen for speed storage and consistency. Children did not need to know which system had been used. They judged the result by more immediate standards. Did the potatoes hold the gravy? Or did the gravy escape toward the green beans? Were they warm in the center? Did they taste buttery salty or faintly like the steam table itself? The ladle of brown gravy brought the tray together, covering a dry edge of meatloaf, and creating the possibility that potatoes, meat and bread could be combined into one agreeable bite. It also erased boundaries. A careful child might rotate the tray to protect the dessert. A less careful child could arrive at the table with gravy touching everything except the milk. Cafeteria trays had compartments, but gravy had ambitions. The complete meal reflected more than taste. By the 1960s, federally supported school lunch had already become an established part of American education, but the actual cooking remained deeply local. School districts worked with different budgets, equipment suppliers donated or purchased foods, staff sizes, and community expectations. One cafeteria might make rolls from dough and mashed potatoes in large kettles. Another might rely more heavily on prepared ingredients. In some places, the meal was inexpensive but still required a coin carried from home. In others, assistants made lunch available to children whose families could not easily pay. For some students, meatloaf day was merely familiar. For others, the hot tray was the most reliable meal of the day. That difference matters. Nostalgia can remember the clatter of forks and the joke someone made about the meatloaf, while history reminds us that the cafeteria was also doing serious work feeding children on schedule, with limited money through systems that were never equally generous in every community. At the table, however, history became personal. One child mixed the potatoes and gravy immediately. Another cut the meatloaf into tiny squares, hoping the lunch period would end first. A third traded canned fruit for a roll and considered the transaction excellent business. The room carried the scrape of chairs, the pop of milk cartons opening the ringing voice of a teacher on lunch duty, and the low roar produced when 100 conversations happened beneath one ceiling. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes and gravy endured in memory because it joined two worlds. It resembled the family dinner many children knew at home, yet it arrived through an institutional line portioned by strangers and eaten under a clock. It could be comforting, disappointing, filling, or all three before the bell rang. And as the tray moved toward the return window, the next great cafeteria memory was already waiting on another day, a soft bun filled with saucy ground beef, promising that lunch could become even messier. The next tray announced itself before it reached the table. A spoonful of saucy ground beef sat inside a soft white bun, already pressing reddish-brown streaks into the bread and threatening the clean shirt beneath it. In many 1960s cafeterias, the sloppy joe was less a sandwich than a test of timing. Eat too slowly and the bottom bun surrendered. Hold it too tightly and the filling escaped from the sides. Try to discuss anything important while taking a bite, and the conversation ended immediately. The mixture varied from school to school, but it was usually built around ground beef, tomato-based sauce, onion, and seasonings that could be prepared in a large kettle or deep pan. One worker could portion it quickly with a scoop, another could close the bun, and the line could keep moving. The result was warm, filling, economical, and almost guaranteed to leave one orange spot somewhere it did not belong. Children did not always call the sandwich by the same name. Some remembered sloppy joes, while other districts used labels such as barbecue beef, or simply a hot beef sandwich, and regional recipes could be sweeter, sharper, thicker, or more loosely spooned. That variation mattered because school lunch was local, even when federal support helped hold the larger system together. A cook used the ingredients available through district purchasing local suppliers or commodity programs, then adjusted the mixture to the equipment, the budget, and the number of mouths expected at noon. The sauce did practical work. It added moisture, carried seasoning through a large batch, and made a measured amount of meat feel substantial inside the bun. It also concealed small differences from one pan to the next, which was useful when hundreds of portions had to look reasonably alike. The package promised no elegance, and the cafeteria did not attempt any. A sloppy joe arrived, soft hot, and honest about the fact that a napkin would be necessary. At the table, the sandwich created its own set of strategies. Some children lifted it with both hands and leaned forward over the tray. Others removed the top bun, ate part of the filling with a fork, and rebuilt the sandwich after the danger had passed. A careful eater might press the edges together before every bite as though sealing an important envelope. Nearby, a milk carton sweated against the tray, canned fruit waited in syrup. and a few potato chips or a vegetable occupied the remaining compartment depending on the district and the day. The lunchroom smelled of tomato sauce, warm bread floor cleaner, and the damp wool of coats hung nearby in winter. Voices bounced from the hard walls, while teachers reminded children to sit down, stop trading until everyone had been served and used the napkin for its intended purpose. Sloppy Joe Day could feel cheerful because the food was familiar, but it also revealed the difference between home and school. At home, someone might add more sauce or choose the least soggy bun. In the cafeteria, the scoop decided. On another lunch day, the bun carried something far easier to identify. A hot dog lay in the centre, sometimes plain, sometimes accompanied by mustard or ketchup, and often paired with baked beans that filled a neighbouring compartment with sweet dark sauce. The combination made sense for institutional service. Frankfurters could be heated in quantity counted with little argument and placed into buns quickly. Baked beans could wait in large pans, remain warm on the serving line, and provide a filling side without requiring delicate last-minute preparation. For children, however, the appeal was simpler. A hot dog looked like picnic food, ballpark food, or the supper served when the family schedule had become too crowded for ceremony. Seeing it at school gave the lunch tray a small holiday feeling, even when the bun had been softened by steam and the beans had already touched it. The beans were not merely decoration. Their sweetness balanced the salty frankfurter, their sauce rescued a dry bun, and their ability to spread across the tray made them almost as ambitious as the gravy from meatloaf day. Some school versions were mild and soft, while others carried bits of onion tomato flavour brown sugar, or molasses notes or small pieces of meat depending on the recipe and region. Children divided sharply over them. One group mixed the beans with everything and finished the compartment first. Another ate around them with the precision of surveyors protecting valuable land. A bean that rolled beneath the hot dog could remain there until tray inspection. Yet the pairing reflected the arithmetic behind many school menus. The main item needed to be recognizable, the side needed to be economical and filling, and the whole meal had to be portioned fast enough that the last child in line still had time to eat. Convenience was real, but it depended on workers opening cases, heating pans, checking temperatures, arranging buns, wiping counters, and cleaning the evidence afterward. Together, Sloppy Joes and hot dogs showed how the 1960s cafeteria translated familiar American sandwiches into meals for a crowd. They were not identical across the country, and they did not appear in every school, but where they were served they left unusually physical memories, the bun collapsing beneath wet, filling the snap or softness of the frankfurter, the sticky baked bean sauce on a fork and the paper napkin that seemed far too small for its assignment. These lunches were inexpensive without being insignificant. They gave children something recognizable in an institutional room and gave school kitchens dishes that could survive large batch preparation and a fast serving line. When the tray finally slid toward the washing area, the shirt might carry a stain, and the bun might be gone, but another cafeteria argument was waiting ahead. Soon the school hamburger would arrive beside oven potatoes, and Friday fish would test whether anything breaded could remain crisp beneath fluorescent lights. The school hamburger arrived with none of the ceremony of a roadside diner. There was no paper hat behind the counter, no shining grill where children could watch the patty sizzle, and no waitress asking whether anyone wanted onions. Instead, a soft bun appeared in one tray compartment with a thin round patty tucked inside, sometimes joined by a slice of cheese, sometimes offered with a packet or spoonful of ketchup, and sometimes left almost impressively plain. Beside it sat potatoes prepared for an institutional kitchen rather than a restaurant fryer. They might be thick oven-browned wedges, sliced potatoes roasted on sheet pans, or another practical version capable of feeding a long lunch line without demanding constant attention. By the time the tray reached the table, The bun had often absorbed a little steam the patty had cooled at the edges, and the potatoes had entered the uncertain territory between crisp and soft. Children still recognized the meal immediately. It was hamburger day, and recognition counted for a great deal when the morning had already included spelling tests, chalk dust, and the announcement of homework. The hamburger suited the cafeteria because it was easy to count, easy to portion, and familiar enough that few children needed an explanation. Whether patties were prepared in the school kitchen or purchased in a more standardized form depended on the district, its equipment, its suppliers, and the year. The 1960s were not one single cafeteria moment. Some schools still relied heavily on cooks mixing shaping, baking, and seasoning food on site, while others gradually used more prepared products that promised consistent size and faster service. Either way, the lunch staff had to place hundreds of meals on trays within a narrow period. A hamburger could move through that system efficiently. One worker handled buns, another added patties, and another completed the plate with potatoes, vegetables, fruit, or dessert. The result might not have dripped with diner-style juices, but it had survived storage, heating, portioning, and a line of restless children. That was its first assignment. Tasting good was the second, and some days the order appeared negotiable. At the table, children improved the hamburger according to whatever resources were available. Ketchup covered many uncertainties. Mustard provided confidence. A slice of pickle, when offered, could be placed carefully in the center or traded to someone who appreciated it more. Some children opened the bun and inspected the patty as though conducting official government work. Others placed the oven potatoes inside the sandwich, creating a thicker lunch that solved both the problem of a dry bun and the problem of eating everything before the bell. The tray filled the air with warm bread, cooked beef ketchup, and the faint smell of the cleaning solution used on the long cafeteria tables. A milk carton stood nearby, colder at the first sip than at the last. The hamburger was rarely beautiful, but it was understandable. It gave the lunchroom one of its quieter forms of comfort, a food that looked roughly like the version served at home at a picnic or from the window of a small drive-in, even if the cafeteria's interpretation had been designed less for pleasure than for orderly distribution. Then Friday arrived, and the round patty gave way to a row of breaded fish sticks. In some communities, fish appeared especially often at the end of the school week, reflecting local religious customs, as well as the practical rhythm of menu planning. The portion might be 2 or 3 rectangular pieces laid beside peas, potatoes, coleslaw, cornbread, or a warm roll. A small spoonful of tartar sauce could sit at the edge of the tray, although not every district served it and not every child trusted it. Fish sticks were visually precise. They looked like food designed with a ruler, their straight edges promising a crisp coating and a mild center. The promise did not always survive the steam table. The first child served might receive a firm golden crust. The last child in line might meet a softer version that bent slightly beneath the fork. Breaded fish had entered the cafeteria prepared to be crunchy, but institutional warmth had other plans. The fish itself was usually mild enough for children who would have resisted anything that still looked unmistakably like a fish. There were no heads, tails, bones on display or questions about where the meal had come from. The breading created a familiar surface, and the rectangular shape made each portion easy to count. Federal fisheries specialists even produced a fish and shellfish guide with quantity recipes for Type A school lunches in 1967, evidence that seafood was being considered not merely as an occasional novelty, but as something school kitchens needed practical help purchasing and preparing in large numbers. Yet the lived experience remained local. One school might bake the fish until the coating browned evenly. Another might serve patties rather than sticks. One district might pair the entree with macaroni and cheese, while another relied on peas and a bread item. Children remembered the details of their own tray, and often assumed everyone else had eaten the same thing. Decades later, conversations about school lunch reveal how many different Americas could fit inside one cafeteria. Fish Stick Day also created a different kind of negotiation. The tartar sauce might be opened first, ignored completely, or used so generously that the fish became merely a delivery system. Lemon was uncommon enough in many lunchrooms to feel almost luxurious when it appeared. Peas rolled away from the fork, the breading separated from the fish. A child who disliked seafood might trade dessert for assistance while another happily collected extra pieces. The lunchroom filled with the scrape of metal utensils, the crinkle of napkins, and the repeated question of whether the coating was supposed to taste that soft. Still, the meal showed why breaded foods became useful in expanding institutional kitchens. They were portionable, recognizable, and capable of moving from storage to oven to tray, with fewer last-minute decisions than many scratch-cooked dishes. The children judged lunch by crispness. The adults behind the counter also had to judge it by cost timing temperature, and whether enough remained for the final class. Hamburgers and fish sticks occupied opposite ends of the cafeteria week one, familiar from cookouts, and roadside stands the other made approachable by breading and geometry. Neither tasted exactly the same in every school, and neither remained crisp for long beneath the fluorescent lights. Yet both became lasting memories because they placed popular American foods inside the strict machinery of the school day. A patty had to fit the bun. A fish portion had to fit the meal pattern. Every tray had to move forward, whether the potatoes were browned or pale, whether the fish snapped or folded, and whether the child receiving it looked pleased or personally betrayed. Soon the serving line would turn away from sandwiches and breaded rectangles toward a deeper pan where noodles, tuna peas, and creamy sauce waited beneath a browned cafeteria crust. A deep rectangular pan waited behind the serving counter, its surface browned at the edges and pale in the center, where noodles, tuna peas, and creamy sauce had settled together. Tuna noodle casserole did not arrive with the neat geometry of a hamburger or fish stick. It came by the scoop. The cafeteria worker pressed a long-handled spoon through the soft top layer, lifted a portion, and placed it into the largest compartment of the tray, where one noodle might hang over the edge as though reconsidering the journey. Steam carried the smell of cooked pasta, canned fish, warm milk sauce, and onion into the lunchroom. Some children recognized the dish immediately because a similar casserole appeared at home on busy weeknights. Others approached it carefully, searching for peas, checking the texture, and trying to determine whether the crunchy piece on top was a breadcrumb, a cracker crumb, or simply a noodle that had spent too long near the oven. The ingredients made practical sense for a school kitchen. Dried noodles could be stored in quantity. Canned tuna waited safely on pantry shelves, and peas added color without requiring delicate preparation. The sauce tied everything together and helped the casserole remain moist while pans waited to be served. Depending on the district and its recipe, that creamy base might begin with a cooked white sauce, a prepared soup, product milk cheese, or some combination chosen for cost and consistency. The mixture could be assembled in large pans before lunch, baked until hot, and divided with a standard scoop rather than sliced into exact pieces. This mattered when several classes were expected to enter the cafeteria one after another. The first group could not receive generous mountains, while the final group found an empty pan. Portioning was part of the recipe, even though children rarely considered the mathematics behind the spoon. Preparing the casserole still required more work than its reputation for convenience suggested. Noodles had to be cooked without becoming completely soft before baking. Cans had to be opened and drained. Sauce had to be mixed. Pea seasoning and tuna had to be distributed so that one section of the pan did not contain all the fish, while another became a district devoted entirely to noodles. The heavy pans then had to be moved into ovens checked, carried to the steam table, and kept warm without drying at the corners. Old advertisements often treated casseroles as effortless meals assembled almost by magic. The cafeteria staff knew better. Convenience meant that the ingredients were dependable, and the process could be repeated. It did not mean that the cans opened themselves, the pans became lighter, or the baked sauce politely removed itself from the metal after lunch. At the table, tuna noodle casserole inspired reactions that were immediate and rarely neutral. Children who liked it mixed the peas into the sauce, used a warm roll to collect the last creamy streaks, and finished before the milk had lost its chill. Children who disliked it developed complicated excavation methods. A fork separated tuna from noodle from pea and acceptable bite from suspicious bite. The casserole's softness made these investigations easy, although not necessarily successful. A child could spend half the lunch period rearranging the portion without reducing its size. Around the tray were the usual sounds: forks, scraping chairs, shifting cartons opening, and a teacher announcing that playing with food did not count as eating it. The dish had no crisp coating, no ketchup disguise, and no bun to hold it together. It simply occupied its compartment and waited for a decision. For many families, the cafeteria version echoed the household economy of the period. Tuna casserole made a relatively modest amount of fish travel through a larger dish, while noodles and sauce supplied the bulk that fed several people. At home, a parent might prepare it because the ingredients were already in the cupboard, because payday was still several days away, or because dinner had to be placed on the table between work errands, homework, and evening activities. At school, the same basic logic expanded from one family to hundreds of children, yet the resemblance was never exact. One household added celery cheese, mushrooms, potato chips, or crushed crackers. Another refused peas on principle. Some children knew a homemade version with a browned, carefully arranged topping, while others encountered the combination only beneath cafeteria lights. Regional preferences, district purchasing kitchen equipment, and the experience of individual cooks shaped what the spoon finally placed on the tray. The casserole also revealed how school food could feel both familiar and strangely anonymous. Meatloaf still looked like a slice from a family table, and a hot dog carried the memory of a picnic. Tuna noodles arrived already blended with every ingredient folded into the work of feeding a crowd. The dish did not tell the child who had opened the cans stirred. The sauce lifted the pans or calculated how many scoops remained. That labour disappeared behind the serving line, leaving only a warm portion and a few browned crumbs. Some students remember the casserole fondly because it tasted gentle, filling, and close to home. Others remember the smell more clearly than the flavour, or the single pea they pushed around until the bell rang. Either response gave the meal a long afterlife. Once the tray was returned and the deep pan had been scraped clean, the next lunch offered a simpler arrangement: 2 slices of bread pressed around melted cheese, waiting beside a bowl of tomato soup for the first soggy corner to be dipped. The grilled cheese sandwich usually reached the tray in a neat golden square, although neatness did not always survive the walk to the table. 2 slices of white bread had been buttered, pressed around melted cheese, and cooked in batches until the outside browned and the inside softened into a warm orange layer. Beside it waited tomato soup, smooth red, and hot enough to fog the air above the bowl or tray compartment. The combination was simple, familiar, and perfectly designed for one small act of cafeteria engineering. A child could lift one corner of the sandwich, lower it into the soup, and hold it there just long enough for the bread to absorb the tomato, without collapsing completely. That first dipped bite was the reward. The second required more caution. By the third, the corner might bend under its own weight, leaving a piece of bread floating in the soup and forcing the spoon to join the operation. For a school kitchen, grilled cheese looked easier than it really was. At home, one sandwich could be watched in a skillet and turned when the bread reached exactly the right shade. In a cafeteria, dozens or hundreds had to be assembled, cooked, held warm, and served during a narrow lunch period. The bread needed enough fat to brown without becoming greasy. The cheese needed to soften before the outside burned. The finished sandwiches had to wait without turning hard at the edges or steaming themselves into complete softness. Some schools used griddles while others relied on sheet pans, ovens, or methods suited to the equipment available in that particular kitchen. The result varied accordingly. One child received a sandwich with a crisp surface and cheese stretching from the first bite. Another received one with pale bread, a firm centre, and the quiet suggestion that melting had been considered but not completed. Tomato soup solved several practical problems at once. It was inexpensive, familiar, easy to prepare in quantity, and capable of remaining warm in a large kettle, while classes arrived one after another. The cafeteria version might be thick and sweet, thin and sharply tomato-flavoured, or softened with milk, depending on the district recipe and the ingredients on hand. A long-handled ladle measured each serving, and the worker at the counter had to leave enough room at the top so that the soup would not spill during the dangerous journey between the serving line and the table. Children learned to carry the tray level. A sudden turn, a bumped elbow, or one classmate stopping without warning could send a red wave toward the sandwich, the napkin, or the clean sleeve that had survived Sloppy Joe Day only a few lunches earlier. At the table, the pairing encouraged personal methods. Some children cut the sandwich diagonally because the pointed corners were easier to dip. Others tore off small pieces and dropped them into the soup, creating something between croutons and surrender. A careful eater dipped quickly and shook off the extra soup before taking a bite. A fearless eater submerged half the sandwich and accepted whatever happened next. The cheese could stretch, the bread could sag, and tomato soup could leave a bright mark around the mouth that no child noticed until someone else did. Around the tray were the familiar cafeteria sounds, spoons touching bowls, chairs scraping the floor, milk cartons opening, and a lunch duty teacher, reminding everyone that blowing bubbles through a straw was not part of the meal. The room smelled of toasted bread, tomato, warm milk, floor wax and damp coats drying near the wall. The combination also carried a strong connection to home. Grilled cheese and tomato soup could appear on a cold Saturday during a quick family lunch, or on an evening when the refrigerator held little that wanted to become dinner. A parent needed bread, cheese, butter, and a can or pot of soup. The meal was inexpensive, comforting, and fast enough to fit between household chores and the next obligation. At school, those same qualities made it useful on a much larger scale, yet children compared the cafeteria version with the one they knew from their own kitchens. At home, the sandwich might contain American cheese cheddar, or whatever slices were available. Someone might spread butter all the way to the crust, cook it slowly, and cut it into triangles. At school, the sandwich had to meet a schedule. It did not know which child preferred extra cheese, darker toast, or the crust removed. The serving line did not take individual orders. What made this lunch memorable was not rarity but ritual. The sandwich and soup arrived as separate foods, but nearly every child understood that they belonged together. The best bite occurred at the border between crisp and soft, where the toasted bread had absorbed just enough tomato to become rich without disappearing. That balance lasted only a moment. Wait too long, and the corner dissolved. Eat too quickly, and the soup remained hot enough to punish enthusiasm. It was an ordinary meal with a built-in small conflict, and that may be why the memory stayed so clear. The cafeteria did not need a holiday decoration or a famous brand mascot. It needed a warm sandwich, a ladle of red soup, and a child deciding how much sogginess counted as perfect. Soon, however, the lunch line would leave the hot kitchen behind. Wax paper would unfold, metal lunch boxes would open, and the next school meals would come from home: peanut butter and jelly, bologna and cheese, and the quiet daily question of what a family had packed before the morning bus arrived. The metal clasp snapped open, the lid lifted, and the smell of wax paper, breadfruit, and whatever had been poured into the thermos escaped into the classroom or cafeteria. Not every 1960s child joined the hot lunch line. Many carried food from home in a metal lunchbox, a brown paper bag, or a reused sack folded at the top, and the sandwich inside often revealed the quiet conditions of the morning kitchen. Peanut butter and jelly was one of the most dependable possibilities. 2 slices of soft white bread held a layer of peanut butter and a bright stripe of grape strawberry, or another household favourite wrapped tightly enough to survive a bus ride, a coat closet, and several hours beside an apple. By noon, the jelly might have soaked into one side, the crust might be pressed flat, and the sandwich might carry the faint taste of whatever else shared the box. It was not elegant, but it remained recognisable after a difficult journey. Peanut butter and jelly worked because it asked very little from a hurried household. It required no stove, no refrigerator at school, and no special container beyond wax paper foil or a small sandwich bag as plastic packaging became more common. A parent could prepare it before breakfast while coffee perked, and children searched for missing shoes, or an older child could make it without much supervision. The ingredients stayed in the cupboard, stretched across several lunches, and pleased enough children to reduce the risk that the sandwich would return home untouched. Some families spread peanut butter on both slices to keep the jelly from soaking through. Others used a thick centre of jelly that made the first bite dangerous to clean clothing. Crunchy or smooth peanut butter, homemade preserves, or supermarket jelly crusts left on or trimmed away, every lunchbox carried a slightly different family rule. The sandwich was simple, although the opinions surrounding it were highly developed. At school, peanut butter and jelly possessed its own exchange value. A child who'd received it 3 days in a row might trade half for cookies, chips, fruit, or a different sandwich. Another child treated it as the safest food in the room and refused every offer. Trading was often discouraged by adults, but lunch tables created their own economy before supervision arrived. Desserts had high value, unwanted fruit had very little, and a well-made peanut butter sandwich could fall somewhere in the middle depending on how badly the bread had been compressed. The wax paper made a dry crackling sound as it unfolded, and a small line of jelly often remained stuck to the crease. Beside the sandwich might be a bruised banana celery sticks, a handful of potato chips, or cookies wrapped separately, so their crumbs did not enter everything else. A thermos could hold milk, juice, soup, or cocoa, though by lunchtime the temperature was not always what the morning had promised. The other familiar package contained bologna and cheese. One round slice of bologna rested between white bread, often joined by a square of processed cheese, a spread of mustard, or a thin layer of mayonnaise if the family expected the lunchbox to remain cool enough. The sandwich had a soft, uniform texture and a smell that announced itself as soon as the wrapper opened. Bologna fitted the household budget, required no cooking, and could be counted slice by slice when several children needed lunches before school. The cheese made the meal feel more complete, while mustard added enough sharpness to wake up bread that had spent the morning pressed beneath a thermos. Some families fried bologna at home for breakfast or supper, watching the centre rise into a dome unless someone cut the edges first. In the lunchbox, however, it remained cold, flat, and practical. A sandwich prepared not for drama but for survival until noon. Bologna and cheese also showed how strongly school lunch remained connected to the family refrigerator. The cafeteria might serve hundreds of children from standardized pans, but the packed lunch carried the decisions of one household. A larger family might buy economical packages and use the same meat throughout the week. One child received mustard while another refused it. One sandwich had 2 slices of bologna because someone had been generous that morning. Another had one slice positioned so carefully that it appeared to cover more bread than it really did. Regional brands and local butcher products varied, and some children brought salami ham, cheese egg salad, pimento cheese, or foods rooted in their family's ethnic traditions instead. The white bread bologna sandwich was familiar, but it was never the only American lunch. School tables gathered together households with different budgets, customs, religions, and ideas about what belonged between 2 slices of bread. Packed lunches could be comforting because they came from home, yet they carried their own small disappointments. Bread absorbed moisture, chips broke into crumbs, a banana flavoured everything nearby. The thermos stopper leaked. An apple rolled against the sandwich until one side became curved. A handwritten note, when included, could feel reassuring or deeply embarrassing depending on who noticed it. The lunchbox itself became part of the memory, dented at the corners, decorated with bright pictures and marked by the smell of yesterday's orange peel if it had not been cleaned thoroughly. At the end of lunch, wrappers were folded, leftovers returned, and the box closed with another metal snap. The next day might bring the same sandwich again, because repetition was one of the ways families made mornings manageable. Peanut butter and jelly and bologna with cheese were ordinary foods, but ordinary foods often preserve the clearest details. They remember the kitchen light before sunrise, the knife wiped against the edge of a jar, the wax paper torn from its roll, and the parent who packed several lunches while trying not to miss the bus schedule. They also remember the moment the box opened among friends, and every child could see what every family had chosen. Some sandwiches were traded, some were eaten down to the crust, some returned home and raised questions at the dinner table. Once the lunchboxes were closed, the story moved back toward the hot serving line, where large pans of macaroni and cheese and spaghetti with meat sauce were waiting to show how the cafeteria handled pasta for hundreds. The macaroni and cheese arrived as a yellow square, a soft scoop or something between the two, depending on how firmly the deep pan had set before the lunch line began. Elbow macaroni disappeared beneath a cheese sauce that might be smooth in the centre and browned along the edges where the first serving spoon had to press through a thin baked crust. Some cafeterias added crumbs on top, while others allowed the cheese itself to form the only covering. When the portion landed on the tray, it held its shape for a moment, then slowly relaxed into the compartment beside green beans, sliced tomatoes, fruit, or a warm piece of bread. Children recognized it immediately, but recognition did not guarantee agreement. One child saw the safest lunch of the week. Another studied the surface for dark, baked corners. A third compared it with the creamier version served at home and decided the school had used the word cheese with considerable optimism. Cooking macaroni and cheese for a cafeteria required a different kind of confidence from making one family casserole. Pounds of dry macaroni had to be boiled in large kettles, drained before the noodles became too soft and mixed with enough sauce to remain moist through baking and holding. Cheese had to melt evenly rather than gathering in one rich corner of the pan. Milk, butter, or margarine seasoning and sometimes dry mustard helped produce a repeatable sauce, while the exact cheese and preparation method varied among districts. Period school lunch guidance treated macaroni and cheese as more than an indulgent side dish. In suitable menus, cheese allowed it to contribute part of the protein-rich portion expected in a complete lunch, although another food might be needed to finish that requirement. Children did not see meal pattern arithmetic. They saw a tray compartment filled with macaroni and immediately calculated whether it could be traded, finished or used to hide the vegetable beside it. The dish revealed the limits of holding food warm for hundreds of diners. Fresh from the oven, the top could be lightly crisp while the center remained creamy. After waiting on the steam table, the noodles continued absorbing sauce. The edges became firmer, and the serving spoon left deep path through the pan. The first lunch period and the last might therefore remember two different foods. A child served early received loose macaroni with cheese clinging between the curves. A child served later might receive a more determined portion that could almost be cut with the fork. Yet macaroni and cheese remained comforting because it required no difficult explanation and contained no hidden ingredient likely to surprise the cautious eater. Its smell was warm, buttery, and familiar. A roll could collect the sauce left on the tray. Even the browned corner had supporters, children who understood that the slightly chewy edge was not a mistake but the most valuable piece in the pan. Spaghetti with meat sauce presented the cafeteria with a less obedient shape. Long noodles did not fit neatly into scoops compartments or the short time available for lunch. They tangled around serving utensils slid from forks and carried red sauce toward shirts with the same determination once shown by the sloppy Joe. Some kitchens mixed the cooked pasta directly with the sauce coating every strand and making portions easier to control. Others placed noodles on the tray first and added a ladle of meat sauce over the top. The sauce commonly combined ground beef tomatoes or tomato products, onion and mild seasonings in proportions designed for quantity cooking. It might be thick enough to remain on the noodles or thin enough to gather beneath them in the tray. A dusting of grated cheese occasionally appeared, but many children remember a simpler arrangement: spaghetti meat sauce, green beans bread with butter dessert and milk. Eating it required technique. A child familiar with restaurant manners might attempt to turn the fork and gather a small bundle, only to discover that cafeteria spaghetti had been cooked softer and cut less predictably than expected. Others chopped the noodles with the side of the fork, producing manageable pieces and abandoning elegance before it could become a problem. One strand could stretch from plate to mouth, carrying a line of tomato sauce across the chin. A rolled sleeve offered only limited protection. The warm bread beside the pasta became an essential tool folded around loose meat sauce or pressed against the tray after the final noodle had been captured. Around the table came the usual warnings about slurping swinging noodles and using a fork rather than examining how far one strand could be stretched. Spaghetti Day brought the promise of something exciting, and the practical reality that excitement needed a larger napkin. For many children, spaghetti also carried a different relationship to home cooking. Italian-American families might know sauces shaped by regional traditions, long simmering, and recipes passed through generations. Other households were making spaghetti more regularly as pasta and tomato-based suppers became familiar economical parts of the broader American weeknight menu. The cafeteria version did not reproduce those family dishes, nor did it try to. It translated pasta into an institutional language of measured ground beef standard portions, large kettles, and a sauce mild enough for a varied room of children. Some students loved it precisely because it felt more adventurous than meatloaf without becoming unfamiliar. Others knew a home version with stronger seasoning and regarded the school sauce as a distant relative who'd forgotten several important details. Macaroni and cheese and spaghetti with meat sauce showed the cafeteria becoming increasingly comfortable with pasta, but they also demonstrated how differently noodles behaved under pressure. Elbow macaroni settled obediently into a baked pan and accepted its assigned scoop. Spaghetti tangled, slipped, stained, and made the tray seem temporarily less organized. Both dishes stretched practical ingredients into filling meals, and both left memories connected as much to texture as flavor. The firm baked edge of macaroni, the soft center beneath it, the tomato-coated strand escaping from a fork, and the piece of bread used to erase the evidence. The next pasta dish would remove even the small distinction between noodles and sauce. In a large kettle, macaroni would meet chili while nearby chicken and thick noodles waited in broth or gravy, ready for the cafeteria's next lesson in feeding a crowd. The large kettle behind the serving line held a mixture that refused to settle on one identity. Elbow macaroni curved through a tomato red sauce with ground beef beans. In some versions, onion and mild seasoning creating the cafeteria dish many children remember as chili mac. Other schools called a similar meal goulash Spanish macaroni, or simply macaroni with meat sauce, and those names did not always describe exactly the same recipe. What mattered to the child holding the tray was more immediate. The macaroni was soft, the sauce was warm, and every spoonful carried enough substance to make the meal feel larger than its ingredients. A square of cornbread, a buttered roll, canned fruit, or a green vegetable might occupy the remaining compartments. The chili mac itself spread outward slowly, leaving a red line on the tray, and promising that any clean shirt sleeve brought too close would not remain innocent for long. For the cafeteria kitchen, chili mac was an exercise in useful expansion. Ground beef supplied flavor and familiarity, but macaroni helped it travel across many more trays. Tomato products created color and moisture, while beans, when included, added weight and made the kettle seem generous without requiring every serving to contain a large amount of meat. The dish could be cooked in quantity held warm and portioned with a ladle or scoop as classes arrived. It also tolerated small variations better than a delicate entree. If the sauce thickened, the macaroni absorbed it. If the mixture needed more volume, additional pasta could help. The cook still had to control the timing because noodles that entered the kettle too early continued softening until the final lunch period. The first class might receive separate elbows coated in sauce. The last might receive a united population that had decided individual noodles were no longer necessary. Children approached chili mac according to the version they knew at home. In one family, chili meant beans, ground beef, tomato, and enough seasoning to warm the kitchen. In another, beans were considered an unacceptable intrusion. Some households called elbow macaroni with beef and tomatoes American goulash, while others used regional names that sounded completely ordinary locally and mysterious elsewhere. The cafeteria simplified these differences into a recipe mild enough for a room full of students. That did not prevent arguments. One child insisted the dish was spaghetti with the wrong noodles. Another called it chili even when no bean could be found. A third mixed in the corn, broke the cornbread over the top, and improved the meal without consulting the menu. The lunchroom smelled of tomatoes, cooked beef, warm bread, and the floor-cleaning solution that seemed capable of joining every school meal without appearing on the tray. In another large kettle, the colour and mood changed completely. Chicken and noodles arrived pale, soft, and quietly steaming, with broad noodles resting in broth or gravy, and small pieces of chicken appearing wherever the serving spoon happened to find them. Peas, carrots, celery, or onion might be included depending on the recipe, but the central memory was usually the noodles. They could be thick and tender, closer to dumplings in some regional versions, or narrower and more familiar in others. The serving worker lifted a heavy spoonful and allowed the extra broth to drain before placing it into the tray compartment. Sometimes the mixture stood alone. In parts of the Midwest, children might remember chicken and noodles served over mashed potatoes, a combination that placed one starch on top of another with complete confidence. It was not a national rule, but where it appeared, nobody could accuse the lunch of being insubstantial. Chicken and noodles required careful kitchen arithmetic. Poultry could be cooked separated from the bones when necessary, cut or pulled into small pieces, and returned to a large volume of broth. Noodles extended the meat across many portions, while gravy or stock carried its flavour through the entire kettle. The dish made good use of modest pieces of chicken, but it also demanded labour that the finished tray concealed. Someone had to handle the poultry, prepare the broth, cook the noodles without letting them dissolve, season the mixture, and keep it hot through several lunch periods. A child receiving one scoop saw perhaps 3 pieces of chicken and a great many noodles. The kitchen staff saw cases, pans, ladles, temperatures, serving counts, and the question of whether the final group would receive the same meal as the first. At the table, chicken and noodles produced fewer stains than chili mac, but more questions about texture. The broad noodles folded over the fork and slipped back into the gravy. A small piece of chicken could hide beneath them until the final bite. If mashed potatoes were served underneath the entire portion, gradually became one soft, warm mixture that could be eaten with almost no resistance. Some children loved that gentleness, especially during cold weather when the cafeteria windows looked grey and coats crowded the hooks outside. Others wanted something crisp, something with a bun, or at least something that did not require searching. A warm roll became useful for collecting broth from the tray, while peas and carrots could be eaten avoided or pushed beneath the noodles in the hope that concealment counted as completion. The dish felt closer to a home supper than many standardized lunches, yet its enormous kettle and measured scoop reminded everyone that this comfort had been prepared for a crowd. Chili mac and chicken with noodles represented 2 different answers to the same cafeteria problem. One used tomato ground beef and macaroni to create a bright, hearty meal with many regional names. The other used broth chicken and soft noodles to turn a modest amount of poultry into something warm and filling. Both depended on large kettles, careful timing, and ingredients capable of stretching without seeming empty. Both changed as they waited, thickening and softening while the lunch line continued. And both carried memories that differed from one district to another, because a child in Ohio, Georgia, New York, or California might recognize the title, but picture an entirely different tray. Soon the kettles would give way to a more ceremonial meal. Turkey dressing and gravy would bring Thanksgiving into the school year, while a chicken pot pie waited beneath its crust with vegetables hidden, where no cautious child could inspect them first. The ordinary cafeteria changed its mood when turkey dressing and gravy appeared on the menu. The same long tables, divided trays, milk cartons, and lunch line rules remained in place, but the food suggested a holiday had briefly entered the school day. A worker placed sliced, chopped, or portioned turkey into the main compartment, added a scoop of dressing, and carried a ladle of gravy across both, with the confidence of someone who knew the tray would soon tilt. Green beans, peas, cranberry sauce, sweet potatoes, or canned fruit might complete the meal depending on the district. A warm roll often occupied the last available space. Children arriving from arithmetic or social studies could suddenly smell sage onion poultry and browned bread in the hallway. The lunch might not match the Thanksgiving dinner served at home, but it borrowed enough familiar details to make an ordinary weekday feel ceremonial. Even the child who normally hurried through lunch might pause long enough to inspect whether the small red serving was truly cranberry sauce or simply another cafeteria experiment. Preparing a holiday-style meal for hundreds of students required more organization than the cheerful menu description revealed. Turkey had to be cooked, carved, chopped, or heated in a form the kitchen could portion consistently. Dressing had to be mixed in deep pans, baked or heated until safe and kept moist through several lunch periods. Gravy had to remain smooth enough to ladle, without becoming a solid layer at the surface or a thin brown lake beneath it. Some schools prepared much of the meal on site, while others relied on central kitchens, purchased products or ingredients chosen for efficiency. The exact form varied widely. One child remembers a recognizable slice of turkey. Another remembers chopped meat under gravy. A third remembers something closer to a formed turkey portion that carried the idea of Thanksgiving more clearly than the texture. The cafeteria was not attempting to reproduce one family's table. It was translating the holiday into pan scoop serving counts and a lunch period that still ended when the bell rang. The dressing carried perhaps the strongest connection to home because every family seemed to have an opinion about what dressing or stuffing should be. In some regions, cornbread formed the base. Elsewhere, white bread cubes, celery, onion herbs, or other family traditions shaped the dish. School kitchens usually needed a version mild enough for many tastes and sturdy enough to survive quantity preparation. That meant the cafeteria serving could seem too soft to one child, too dry to another, and completely correct to a third who had grown up with something similar. Gravy improved nearly every outcome. Its softened, firm dressing gave flavour to plain turkey and linked the separate portions into one brown steaming landscape. Cranberry sauce, when offered, introduced a bright, sweet contrast and an immediate division of opinion. Some children ate it first, others moved it to the farthest compartment as though distance could remove it from the meal requirements. The roll became useful for collecting gravy, building a small turkey sandwich, or quietly replacing whatever vegetable remained untouched. This special lunch also exposed the distance between memory and circumstance. For many children, the tray echoed a crowded family table, holiday dishes, relatives arriving in coats, and the sound of adults speaking from the kitchen. For others, the school meal may have been more abundant or dependable than what waited at home. A nostalgic story about turkey and dressing should not turn every household into the same warm scene. Families differed in income, region, religion, custom, and access to food and schools differed sharply in funding and facilities. Yet the cafeteria meal could still create a shared moment. Children who brought lunches from home sometimes watched the hot line with unusual interest. Teachers might eat a similar plate nearby. The smells remained in the building through the afternoon, following students back toward classrooms, where concentration became more difficult after gravy dressing and milk. Thanksgiving had been compressed into one tray, served in shifts and cleared away before spelling began again. Chicken pot pie offered a different kind of anticipation, because its most important ingredients were hidden. The child saw a browned pastry top, an individual pie in a small foil pan, or a scoop of creamy chicken filling covered by biscuit dough, depending on the school and its kitchen system. Beneath that surface waited chicken gravy peas, carrots, potatoes, celery, or other vegetables that could not be judged until the crust was broken. The first touch of the fork released steam and opened a small window into the filling. A cautious child widened that opening, slowly moving pieces aside to identify them. An impatient child cut through the centre and discovered that the inside was far hotter than the crust had suggested. Pot pie looked tidy when it arrived, but the first bite transformed it into pastry fragments, creamy sauce and vegetables spreading across the tray. It was comfort food with a concealed inspection, for the kitchen pot pie turned modest pieces of poultry and vegetables into a complete-looking entree. A creamy sauce carried the flavour through the filling, while pastry or biscuit topping gave the meal substance and visual appeal. Individual frozen pies offered one form of convenience where districts used them, but many cafeteria versions could also be assembled in large pans and portioned after baking. Neither method eliminated the work. Pans had to be heated thoroughly, crusts had to brown without burning, and the filling had to remain hot enough for safe service without punishing the first child who bit into it. Holding time created its usual complications. A crisp top softened above the steam table. Sauce thickened. The bottom crust of an individual pie could become tender beneath the filling. The package or recipe might promise a self-contained meal, yet the tray often showed that containment was temporary. At the table, chicken pot pie produced a careful archaeology. Peas were uncovered one by one. Carrot cubes appeared beneath folds of pastry. A small piece of chicken could feel like a discovery worth protecting from the vegetable mixture around it. Some children stirred everything together and ate the filling with the crust. Others removed the pastry top, finished it first, and then considered whether the contents deserved further attention. The meal was warm filling, and close to dishes served in many homes, but the hidden vegetables made it more uncertain than Turkey Day. Still, both lunches carried a sense of occasion. Turkey and dressing brought the holiday table into school, while pot pie placed an entire supper beneath one crust. Once those trays had been returned, the menu would become less ceremonial and more practical again. Beef stew and Salisbury steak were waiting along with enough brown gravy to make the mashed potatoes feel important. Beef stew reached the serving line without needing to prove what it was. The large kettle held dark gravy soft potatoes, carrots, onion, and small cubes of beef that appeared only after the ladle had searched properly. A cafeteria worker stirred from the bottom, lifted a heavy portion, and placed it into the deepest tray compartment where the sauce spread slowly toward the bread. The smell was warm and familiar, especially on cold days when wet coats hung near the cafeteria entrance and the windows looked grey beneath the winter sky. A biscuit or roll usually waited nearby, ready to collect the gravy that the fork could not manage. The stew seemed simple, but every serving carried a small question. Would this scoop contain several pieces of beef or mostly potatoes? Children watched the ladle with great interest, because fairness in a cafeteria could be measured by the number of meat cubes visible above the gravy. For the kitchen beef stew made practical use of time moisture and ingredients that became more tender through long cooking. The meat could be cut into manageable pieces, browned or added to the kettle, according to the recipe, then cooked with vegetables and liquid until the separate ingredients formed one substantial meal. Potatoes helped fill the bowl or tray, carrots added colour, and gravy carried the flavour of the beef into every bite. The dish could be prepared in quantity and kept warm while several groups of students moved through the lunchroom. That holding time often softened everything further. Carrots lost their sharp edges. Potatoes began to break apart. The gravy thickened as starch entered the broth. By the last lunch period, the stew might look less like separate meat and vegetables and more like a united cafeteria policy. It was still warm, still filling, and still capable of making a biscuit necessary. Children developed methods for eating it. Some broke the biscuit into pieces and dropped them directly into the gravy, creating soft dumplings without asking permission from the recipe. Others opened the biscuit, placed beef and potatoes inside, and built a sandwich that could not be lifted safely. A cautious eater removed the carrots first. A determined one searched for every piece of meat before eating anything else, worried that an unguarded cube might somehow disappear. The stew's sauce made the divided tray less divided, especially when it crossed into the vegetable compartment or reached the dessert. Cafeteria workers had designed the meal to be served efficiently, but the tray presented it as a series of territorial disputes. The bread wanted the gravy. The potatoes were already surrounded by it. The canned fruit needed protection. Somewhere nearby, a teacher reminded a child that stirring the entire lunch into one brown mixture was not required. Salisbury steak brought the same brown gravy into a more formal arrangement. An oval ground beef patty sat beside mashed potatoes, often topped with onions or a smooth ladle full of sauce. It looked more serious than a hamburger because it had abandoned the bun and accepted a plate, a fork, and a name that suggested adulthood. The shape helped school kitchens portion it easily, while the ground meat allowed seasonings, crumbs, or other ingredients to be mixed throughout. Some cafeterias prepared formed patties in their own kitchens, while others used purchased products suited to institutional ovens and serving lines. The result varied in thickness, texture, and flavour. One school served a tender patty that broke easily beneath the fork. Another served a firmer version requiring a small amount of determination. Gravy reduced the difference. It softened the surface, added moisture, and made the mashed potatoes beside it feel like part of the same plan. The potatoes were rarely an accidental companion. Their pale mound provided a place for the gravy to collect, and many cafeteria workers pressed a shallow depression into the top before filling it with sauce. Children recognized this as useful design. A gravy well protected the rest of the tray for several seconds provided the tray remained level. Some students cut the Salisbury steak into small pieces and mixed them directly into the potatoes. Others kept the food separate, combining one measured bite at a time. The patty could taste of beef onion pepper, or mainly of the gravy placed over it. A green vegetable, warm roll fruit serving and milk completed the tray, but the centre of attention remained the brown sauce travelling between meat and potatoes. It covered dry edges, carried seasoning, and made an institutional meal resemble the kind of supper many families served at home. At home, Salisbury steak occupied a useful place between hamburger and roast. It gave ground beef a more respectable appearance and allowed a family cook to serve meat with gravy without buying a large expensive cut. Packaged frozen dinners also helped make the name familiar, presenting oval patties, potatoes, vegetables and dessert in separate foil compartments. The school version reflected similar ideas of portioning and economy, though it arrived from a large kitchen rather than an individual tray from the freezer. Many children understood the dish before they understood its name. It was a hamburger without bread covered in gravy and expected to behave like steak. That description was accurate enough for lunchtime. The cafeteria did not require anyone to discuss culinary definitions. It required the child to eat before the bell and return the tray without leaving the fork inside the milk carton. Beef stew and Salisbury steak showed two ways school kitchens could make beef feel generous. The stew divided it into small pieces and surrounded it with vegetables, potatoes, and broth. Salisbury steak shaped ground meat into a complete portion and gave it the ceremony of gravy. Neither dish depended on expensive cuts or last-minute cooking. Both could be prepared for crowds held warm and served with bread and potatoes that extended the meal. Their strongest memory may be less about the meat than the sauce dark gravy, gathering beneath the stew-brown gravy sliding over an oval patty, and mashed potatoes waiting nearby for their assigned share. The next cafeteria meals would stretch ground beef even further, turning it into hamburger gravy over potatoes and chili beside cornbread, where one scoop of meat could quietly become lunch for an entire table. Hamburger gravy did not need an elegant shape because the mashed potatoes provided all the structure the meal required. A cafeteria worker placed a rounded scoop of potatoes into the tray, pressed the ladle above it, and covered the pale mound with ground beef suspended in brown or creamy gravy. The dish had different names from one school district to another. Some menus called it hamburger gravy, others ground beef gravy, and some children simply remembered it as meat and gravy over potatoes. Whatever the official wording, the appearance was unmistakable. Small pieces of beef rested throughout the sauce onions occasionally showed themselves, and the potatoes disappeared beneath a coating that made every bite taste roughly the same. A vegetable, bread, fruit and milk completed the lunch, but the tray's centre had already become one soft landscape of potatoes, meat and gravy. The meal was built around the useful fact that ground beef could be divided almost indefinitely when sauce and starch were willing to help. Instead of giving every child a separate patty, the kitchen browned the meat, broke it into small pieces and folded it into enough gravy to cover many servings. The potatoes supplied warmth and volume while a roll or slice of bread collected whatever remained. This was not a trick unique to schools. Families watching the grocery budget use similar methods at home, turning a modest package of hamburger into gravy for potatoes, toast biscuits, rice or noodles. In the cafeteria, the same arithmetic expanded into enormous pans and kettles. Each ladle contained a little meat, a great deal of sauce, and the quiet promise that no one would leave lunch claiming there had been nothing substantial on the tray. The texture divided children as sharply as the taste. Those who liked the meal mixed the potatoes and gravy, immediately pressing the fork through the mound until no white section remained. Others ate around the edges, searching for the larger pieces of ground beef, and leaving the soft mixture for last. The potatoes might be smooth or slightly grainy, while the gravy could be dark and onion-flavoured in one school, and pale, mild and milk-based in another. By the final lunch period, both had usually thickened. The serving spoon left ridges in the pan, and the gravy no longer travelled as freely as it had for the first class. A child might turn the tray sideways and discover that the food remained exactly where it had been placed. This was useful for clean clothing, though less encouraging for anyone hoping the gravy would improve the green beans. The dish carried almost none of the drama of pizza hot dogs or spaghetti. It did not arrive inside a bun beneath a crust or covered with bright red sauce. Its appeal was quieter. It was warm on a cold day, easy to eat with one fork, and familiar to children whose families served similar suppers at home. The smell of browned meat and onion reached the tables before the first tray arrived, mingling with warm bread and the damp coats near the cafeteria door. A child could finish it quickly, use the roll to wipe the compartment clean, and still have time to trade fruit or open a dessert. Hamburger gravy was not designed to become anyone's most exciting memory. It became memorable because it appeared repeatedly, asked very little from the eater, and represented the kind of plain meal that seemed ordinary until decades had passed. Chili with cornbread used the same ground beef but gave it a stronger personality. A deep kettle held tomatoes, meat, onions, seasoning and beans in many regional versions, though not every school recipe included them. The chili was ladled into a bowl, or the deepest section of a tray where it arrived beside a yellow square of cornbread. Some cafeteria chili was thick enough to stand on the spoon. Other versions were closer to soup with a red broth that quickly entered the corners of the tray. The seasoning was usually restrained because the kitchen had to feed children with very different tolerances for heat. The menu might call the dish chili con carne beef and bean chili or simply chili, but few school versions were likely to frighten anyone with spice. The greater danger came from carrying a full tray without sending a red wave toward the milk carton. Cornbread gave children several ways to manage the meal. Some ate the square separately, saving its sweet or savoury crumb as relief from the tomato sauce. Others broke it over the chili, allowing the pieces to soften and thicken the broth. A child might split the square and spread butter across the warm centre if a pat had been provided. Cornbread recipes varied widely. In parts of the South, children may have known versions with little or no sweetness, while other cafeterias served softer, sweeter squares that seemed almost ready to become dessert. That difference could make the school version comforting or completely wrong according to the standards of home. The bread carried regional expectations more clearly than the chili itself. One family wanted it crumbly and plain, another expected a tender yellow cake. The cafeteria chose one version and served it to everyone. Chili worked well in a large school kitchen because it could be prepared in a kettle held warm and adjusted to the ingredients available. Beans and tomato products helped extend the meat, while cornbread added a filling grain component beside it. Yet the finished tray concealed hours of work. Ground beef had to be cooked, and drained onions, prepared cans, opened seasoning, measured batter, mixed pans baked, and hundreds of portions kept hot until the last class arrived. Children saw a ladle of chili and a square of bread. The staff behind the counter saw quantities, temperature schedules, and the possibility that one kettle might not be enough. Hamburger, gravy, and chili therefore told the same economic story in different accents. one softened ground beef beneath brown gravy and potatoes. The other surrounded it with tomatoes, beans, and cornbread. As those kettles emptied, the next lunches would stretch their ingredients more quietly still, with navy bean soup simmering beside cornbread and creamed chicken spread across a slice of toast. Navy bean soup arrived without decoration. A deep kettle held pale beans, cloudy broth, softened onion, and small pieces of ham that appeared only when the ladle happened to find them. The cafeteria worker stirred before each serving, because the beans settled heavily near the bottom, while the broth waited above, and no child wanted to receive a bowl containing only liquid, while the next tray carried all the substance. Beside the soup sat a square of cornbread, yellow or lightly browned, sometimes with a small pat of butter beginning to soften against its surface. On a cold school day, the steam rose toward the fluorescent lights and carried the smell of beans, onion, and smoked meat across the lunchroom. The meal looked modest compared with a hamburger or holiday turkey tray, but it was warm, filling, and difficult to finish quickly. Beans required patience from the spoon and from the child holding it. Dried beans had long offered households and institutional kitchens a practical way to feed many people without relying on a large portion of meat. Once soaked and cooked, they expanded into a substantial kettle, while a ham bone, small pieces of ham, or another seasoning meat could spread flavor through the entire batch. School recipes and ingredients varied, and not every bowl contained the same combination, but the basic logic remained clear. Beans stored well, cost less than many meat-centered entrees and tolerated long cooking. Cornbread supplied a sturdy companion that could be baked in wide pans and cut into regular squares. Together they created a lunch that depended more on time than expensive ingredients. Yet simplicity did not mean the work was small. Beans had to be sorted, soaked, or prepared according to the kitchen's method, cooked until tender without dissolving, completely seasoned carefully, and kept hot while several classes passed through the line. At the table, navy bean soup divided children according to texture. Some liked the soft beans and broke cornbread directly into the bowl, allowing the crumbs to absorb broth until the spoon lifted something thick and comforting. Others ate the cornbread first, and regarded the soup as a collection of pale objects requiring investigation. A piece of ham could become the most valuable discovery in the bowl, protected until the final spoonful, or eaten immediately before it disappeared beneath the beans. The broth left a faint film on the spoon, and the beans pressed softly against the roof of the mouth. If the cornbread was dry, the soup repaired it. If the soup was thin, the cornbread repaired that. The pairing showed a level of cooperation rarely achieved by the children eating it. Around them came the usual sounds of metal spoons, chair legs, milk cartons, and a teacher reminding someone that beans were not intended to be launched across the table. For some children, bean soup carried the taste of home church suppers or a grandparent's kitchen. For others, it was unfamiliar or too closely associated with a meal, served when the grocery budget needed to stretch. That history deserves care. Economical food was not meaningless food, and a modest lunch did not automatically become a sad one. A skilled cook could build deep flavor from beans, onion seasoning, and thyme. At the same time, school lunch mattered because not every child arrived with the same security at home. A hot bowl could be ordinary to one student and essential to another. The cafeteria concealed those differences by placing similar portions on similar trays. Children saw the same square of cornbread and the same ladle of soup, even though the meaning of that meal changed from table to table. Creamed chicken over toast stretched its ingredients in a different direction. A slice of toasted white bread lay flat in the main tray compartment, only to disappear beneath a spoonful of creamy chicken sauce. Small pieces of poultry rested among peas, carrots, celery, or other vegetables depending on the district recipe. In some schools, a similar dish might have been called chicken a la king, while elsewhere the menu used the more direct name cream chicken. The sauce was pale, warm, and thick enough to remain on the bread for a few moments. Then it began soaking downward. The toast softened from the centre outward, leaving crisp corners only if the tray reached the table quickly. A child who wanted texture had to act immediately. Cafeteria toast did not wait for careful conversation. The dish allowed a relatively modest amount of chicken to flavour many portions. Poultry could be cooked, chopped into small pieces, and distributed through a white sauce, made in quantities large enough for the lunch line. Vegetables added colour and volume, while toast provided an inexpensive base that turned one ladle into a complete-looking entree. The kitchen staff had to balance the sauce carefully. Too thin, and it ran across the tray before reaching the table. Too thick, and it sat on the toast like paste. Holding time altered both parts of the meal. The sauce continued thickening and the bread continued absorbing it. The first lunch period might receive toast with a crisp edge and creamy centre. The last could receive something closer to bread pudding with chicken, a transformation no menu had advertised but the steam table had completed. Children responded according to how they felt about foods touching. Those who enjoyed the dish cut through bread and sauce together, gathering chicken, toast and vegetables in one soft bite. Others tried to remove the creamed mixture and restore the toast to its original condition, a project with very little chance of success. Peas could be separated, carrots could be moved, the sauce could not be persuaded to leave the bread. Some students remembered it as gentle comfort food, especially when served with mashed potatoes or a warm vegetable. Others remembered only the pale appearance and the surrender of the toast beneath it. Yet the meal reflected the same quiet household arithmetic as bean soup. A small amount of a more costly ingredient travelled farther when surrounded by sauce bread, broth or beans. Nothing about the tray announced scarcity planning or labour. It simply arrived warm and expected to be eaten. Navy bean soup with cornbread and creamed chicken over toast were meals built to stretch without calling attention to the stretching. One used dried beans and thyme with meat, serving mainly as flavour. The other divided chicken into small pieces and allowed sauce and bread to carry it across many trays. Both were soft, economical, and well suited to large kitchens. Both also depended on cooks who understood how long a kettle could wait, how thick a sauce should become, and how many servings remained before the final class entered. Their memories are quieter than pizza or hamburgers, but perhaps more revealing. They show how school cafeterias turned ordinary ingredients into dependable lunches, while making the calculation almost invisible. Beyond the soup kettle, another regional mystery was waiting inside a bun where barbecued beef could mean something entirely different from one school district to the next. The barbecued beef sandwich arrived on a soft bun carrying a name that sounded familiar, and a filling that could change completely from one school district to the next. In one cafeteria, the meat was finely ground and stirred into a sweet tomato sauce until it resembled a thicker, darker cousin of the sloppy Joe. In another, the beef was shredded into strands and coated just enough to hold together. Some children received a smoky, tangy sandwich with visible onion. Others met a mild red mixture designed mainly to stay inside the bun until the tray reached the table. The menu might say barbecued beef, barbecue sandwich, beef, barbecue, or another local variation, and every community seemed certain its wording was the ordinary one. The bun offered no assistance in settling the argument. It softened beneath the sauce, absorbed the edges of the filling, and began collapsing before the first bite whenever the serving line moved slowly. The word barbecue carried much more regional meaning than a school menu could explain. Across the United States, families used it for different meat sources, cooking methods, and social occasions. In some places, barbecue suggested meat cooked slowly with smoke. Elsewhere, the same word could describe ground or shredded meat simmered in a seasoned tomato sauce on the stove. Cafeteria cooks were not attempting to reproduce every local tradition. They needed a sandwich that could be prepared in quantity held warm, portioned quickly, and accepted by enough children to keep the lunch line moving. That practical need produced a broad category rather than one national recipe. A child in the Midwest might remember something sweet and finely textured. A child in the South might expect a stronger vinegar note or compare it unfavourably with the barbecue served at family gatherings. In another district, the sandwich may have been so close to a sloppy joe that only the menu board knew the difference. Behind the counter, the filling worked because sauce made the beef travel farther. Ground meat could be browned and broken apart, while shredded meat could be mixed with enough liquid to remain moist through several lunch periods. Tomato products, onion vinegar, sugar seasoning and other ingredients varied according to local recipes, available supplies, and the taste a district believed children would accept. The sauce carried flavour through the batch and helped keep the meat from drying on the steam table. It also made portioning easier. A long-handled scoop could lift a measured serving, place it on the bottom bun, and move the tray forward. The challenge was thickness. Too dry and the sandwich became crumbly and difficult to swallow. Too wet and the filling escaped before the child found a seat. Cafeteria barbecue needed to remain loose enough to taste sauced and firm enough to respect the boundaries of bread. It did not always succeed. The side dishes revealed another layer of local habit. Barbecued beef might appear beside baked beans, coleslaw, corn potato salad, oven potatoes, canned fruit, or a simple vegetable chosen more for meal planning than thematic harmony. Coleslaw offered a cool, crisp contrast when children were willing to eat it. Some placed it directly inside the sandwich, whether or not the cafeteria intended that combination. Baked beans extended the sweet, dark flavour of the sauce into another compartment, and created an especially dangerous tray for clean sleeves. A pickle slice, when available, could sharpen the whole meal or become instant trading material. The milk carton waited nearby with no regional opinion at all. As children carried the tray, barbecue sauce shifted toward the bun, bean sauce moved in the opposite direction, and the paper napkin began its brief career already outnumbered. At the table, the sandwich required the same forward lean learned on Sloppy Joe Day, but children often believed barbecue deserved a different strategy. Shredded beef could pull out in long strands, leaving part of the bite attached to the bun and part hanging beneath it. Ground versions squeezed from the sides when gripped too firmly. Some students opened the sandwich and ate the filling with a fork until the bread became manageable. Others pressed the bun flat, accepting that compression was the only available form of control. The smell was sweet, tomato-rich, and sometimes faintly smoky, mingling with warm bread and the sharper scent of coleslaw. Around the room, children compared the school sandwich with versions served at home church picnics, local restaurants, reunions, and neighbourhood gatherings. One child thought the cafeteria had made barbecue too sweet. Another thought it needed more sauce. A third had never eaten any other version, and therefore considered the school recipe the official standard. That comparison made barbecued beef unusually personal. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes could vary, but most children agreed on the general idea. Barbecue belonged to place. It carried family methods, local ingredients, community gatherings, and strongly defended definitions. A cafeteria could place the word on a menu, but it could not prevent children from measuring the sandwich against what their relatives made. Some families used pork more often than beef. Some cooked outdoors. Some prepared sauced meat in a kitchen pot without smoke at all. Religious practice, regional livestock traditions, household income and local taste all shaped what barbecue meant before the child entered school. The cafeteria version flattened those differences into one portion on one bun, yet the reactions around the table quietly restored them. Every complaint or compliment revealed a home recipe standing behind it. The sandwich also showed why naming old cafeteria foods requires caution. Memories preserve flavor more reliably than official terminology. One former student may remember barbecued beef, while a classmate from the same district insists it was called a barbecue burger. A surviving menu might use a brief label that concealed the actual recipe, and two schools using the same name may have served noticeably different fillings. The most accurate way to remember the dish is therefore not as one standardized national sandwich, but as a family of practical cafeteria meals, beef sauce bun, and a local definition of barbecue strong enough to survive for decades. Once the last stained tray moved toward the washing area, another disputed cafeteria favorite waited ahead. It came not from a steaming kettle, but from a rectangular pan where an early pizza square was beginning its slow rise towards school lunch fame. The pizza square did not yet rule the 1960s cafeteria. In some schools, especially as the decade moved forward, a child might reach the serving counter and see a rectangular piece of crust covered with red sauce-melted cheese and perhaps a scattering of finely crumbled meat. In many other districts, pizza remained absent from the menu or appeared only occasionally, still carrying the excitement of a food associated more with neighborhood restaurants and family treats than with the ordinary school week. The cafeteria piece rarely resembled the round pie children saw being cut into triangles elsewhere. Its straight edges came from the pan, and its shape fit neatly into the largest tray compartment. One side might be browned, another pale, and the corner pieces carried more crust than the center. It looked modern, convenient, and unusually cheerful beside Pea's canned fruit and the milk carton that reminded everyone this was still an official lunch. The crust could tell the story of the kitchen before the first bite. Some school pizza was built on dough mixed and spread into large sheet pans, while other versions depended more heavily on prepared crusts or products available to the district. The exact method varied, and the iconic standardized rectangle remembered from later decades should not be pushed backward into every 1960s lunchroom. Where cooks assembled pizza on site, the dough had to be mixed, allowed to rise or rest according to the recipe, pressed across pans covered with sauce, and baked quickly enough to serve several classes. The pan created order. Instead of cutting a round pizza into unequal wedges, workers could divide rows into portions that looked reasonably similar. Reasonably was the important word. The child receiving a broad center square and the child receiving a narrow edge piece did not always share the same understanding of fairness. The sauce was usually mild tomato-rich and spread thin enough that the crust remained visible near the edges. It might contain onion herbs, ground beef, sausage-like crumbles, or no meat at all depending on the school's recipe and menu requirements. Cheese formed a soft layer across the top, sometimes bubbling in brown spots, and sometimes melting into a smooth orange-white surface. Fresh from the oven, the bottom might have offered a little resistance. After waiting beneath warming lights or on a steam table, the crust softened, the cheese settled, and the entire square became more flexible than its geometry suggested. A child could lift it by one corner and watch the opposite end bend toward the tray. Folding was not necessarily planned, but it became useful. So did the fork, especially when the cheese left the crust in one complete sheet and attempted to travel with the first bite. Pizza Day changed the emotional temperature of the lunch line. Meatloaf bean soup and cream chicken could be comforting, but they looked like foods adults had chosen for practical reasons. Pizza looked as though children might have been consulted. The smell of baked bread, tomato sauce, and cheese reached beyond the serving counter, and students entering the cafeteria often knew the menu before reading it. Those who usually brought sandwiches from home might study the hot lunch line with sudden interest. A child who disliked the vegetable beside the pizza could still feel that the tray contained one unquestionable victory. The square was easy to recognize, possible to eat without a spoon, and close enough to restaurant food to make lunch feel less institutional. Even a mediocre piece gained strength from rarity. When pizza appeared only once in a while, anticipation supplied some of the flavor. The remaining tray compartments prevented the meal from becoming too rebellious. Green beans, peas, corn, coleslaw, or a simple salad could sit beside the pizza, while canned peaches, applesauce fruit cocktail, or gelatin waited farther away. A milk carton completed the arrangement and allowed the cafeteria to present the square not as a snack, but as part of a full school meal. Children naturally reorganized the official plan. Corn kernels were placed on top as additional decoration. A roll, when inexplicably provided beside a bread-based entree, might be saved for later. The pizza could be eaten crust first, cheese first, or folded around whatever side dish seemed compatible. Ketchup was unnecessary, but not always considered so. The cafeteria had spent years teaching children that foods belonged in separate tray compartments. Pizza Day encouraged them to test whether those boundaries were legally binding. The square also showed American tastes changing. Pizza had been familiar for generations within Italian-American communities and in cities with established pizzerias, but its broader national visibility increased after the Second World War and continued through the 1950s and 1960s. By the time some school systems placed it on their menus, children could recognize the name even if their families did not eat it regularly at home. The cafeteria translated that growing popularity into the language of quantity food service: broad pans, mild seasoning, measured toppings, straight cuts and portions that could pass rapidly through the line. It was less a copy of one regional pizza tradition than a school kitchen interpretation of an increasingly national food. That interpretation would become more standardized and far more common in later decades, which is why many people remember rectangular cafeteria pizza most strongly from the 1970s, 1980s, or beyond. For a 1960s child who did receive it, however, the early pizza square could remain fixed in memory. There was the thin red line of sauce near the crust, the browned cheese at one corner, the floury or slightly oily bottom, and the moment the slice bent when lifted. There was the argument over edge pieces and center pieces, the quick trade of an unwanted vegetable, and the disappointment of discovering that the last class had received pizza less crisp than the first. The meal felt new without being difficult, modern, without requiring explanation and special, without any holiday on the calendar. Yet pizza had not conquered every cafeteria, and that limitation is part of its story. It entered gradually district by district while older foods continued to fill the trays. On the next lunch day, excitement might come from something far less fashionable, a warm yeast roll baked in the school kitchen, whose smell reached the hallway before anyone knew what entree would be served beside it. The warm yeast roll sometimes reached the tray before the child noticed anything else. Its top was smooth and lightly browned, its sides pale where neighbouring rolls had touched in the pan, and its centre gave way beneath the fingers with a softness no canned vegetable could compete with. A small pat of butter might sit beside it, still firm when the tray left the serving line and beginning to melt by the time the child found a seat. The roll carried the smell of yeast flour, and warm bread through the cafeteria doors, often reaching the hallway before lunch began. Meatloaf might be under gravy, green beans might be waiting in their compartment, and fruit might shine beneath syrup, but the bread had already won the room. Decades later, many former students can describe the roll more clearly than the entree served beside it. They remember pulling it apart, watching steam rise from the centre, and deciding whether to eat it first or save it for the final bite. In schools that baked rolls on site, the process began long before the lunch bell. Flour had to be measured in quantities large enough to fill mixing bowls that looked more suited to machinery than family cooking. Yeast needed warmth and time. Liquid fat, salt, and sometimes sugar were combined according to a quantity recipe designed to produce dozens or hundreds of nearly equal pieces. The dough had to be mixed, allowed to rise, divided, shaped, arranged in pans, given another chance to expand and baked at the proper moment. If the timing slipped, the rolls could be ready too early and dry while waiting, or too late while the lunch line formed outside. A home baker might adjust one batch by touch and instinct. Cafeteria workers had to repeat that judgment across trays of dough, while soup simmered, vegetables heated, and the main course demanded attention. The roll looked simple because the labour behind it had been organised so carefully. Shaping the dough created the familiar pull-apart sides many children remembered. Individual pieces were placed close together in a pan, and as they rose they pressed gently against one another. Baking browned the exposed tops while leaving the joined edges soft. A cafeteria worker could separate the finished rolls by hand or with a utensil, placing one on each tray with remarkable speed. The size needed to remain fairly consistent because the kitchen was feeding a count, not an open-ended family table. Still, no two rolls were completely alike. One had a darker crown, another carried a folded seam underneath. A corner roll developed a firmer outer edge, while a centre roll remained soft on nearly every side. Children noticed these differences with the seriousness usually reserved for playground teams. A large round roll seemed like good fortune. A small or over-browned one could feel like a personal decision made by the serving line. The butter created its own short drama. In some cafeterias it arrived as a small wrapped pat. Elsewhere, margarine or a spread suited to the district budget and purchasing system took its place. The child had to decide whether to open the roll neatly with a knife, pull it apart with both hands, or press the butter directly against the warm surface and hope patience would do the rest. A cold pat tore the soft bread if spread too quickly. A warm one disappeared into the centre and left a shining layer along the torn edges. Some children used half the roll to collect gravy soup or sauce, and protected the other half for butter. Others placed meatloaf turkey or Salisbury steak between the pieces and built a small sandwich that had never appeared on the printed menu. The roll accepted every assignment. It could rescue dry meat, gather tomato sauce, soften bean soup, or provide a safe final bite after the vegetable compartment had been endured. Not every school baked bread from scratch, and even among those that did, practices differed with staffing equipment, budgets, and local tradition. Some cafeterias purchased bread or received meals from a central kitchen. Others had experienced bakers who became known throughout the school for rolls, biscuits, cinnamon buns, or desserts. The phrase school-made roll therefore belongs to particular memories rather than one universal American experience. Yet where the tradition existed, it gave the cafeteria a connection to older household and community baking. The smell resembled a church basement supper, a grandmother's kitchen, or the dinner rolls served on Sundays. At the same time, the scale was unmistakably institutional. Sheet pans moved on racks, mixing equipment hummed. Workers shaped dough while wearing aprons and hair coverings with a clock deciding when every batch had to enter and leave the oven. Comfort was being produced according to a schedule. The roll also revealed how much children valued freshness. Cafeteria food often spent time waiting. Fish breading, softened pasta, absorbed sauce toast disappeared beneath creamed chicken, and gravy thickened as lunch periods passed. Bread offered a brief exception when it came from the oven at the right moment. The outside remained warm, the centre stayed tender, and the smell seemed more immediate than anything held in a steam table pan. The first classes might receive rolls almost too hot to open. Later groups encountered bread that was merely warm, then room temperature, though even a cooled school roll could remain desirable if it had started well. A child might tuck one into a napkin for later, despite rules against carrying food from the cafeteria. Another might trade dessert for a second. The roll was technically an accompaniment, but lunch table economics often promoted it to the main attraction. Its disappearance from many school memories reflects broader changes in food service, rather than one sudden decision. Labour costs centralised preparation, purchased bread products, standardised convenience foods, changing kitchen facilities and tighter schedules gradually made daily scratch baking less practical in numerous districts. Some schools continued the tradition, and others preserved individual recipes long after the original cooks retired. Former students sometimes search for those formulas, hoping to recreate a roll remembered not through exact measurements, but through smell warmth and the feel of the soft centre pulling apart. Reproducing it at home can be difficult because memory has included the entire room, the clatter of trays, the butter wrapper, the lunch bell, the friends at the table, and the worker who placed the bread beside the entree. The roll tasted like flour yeast and fat. It also tasted like being 10 years old at noon. The warm yeast roll mattered because it showed how one modest piece of bread could make an institutional meal feel handmade. It required planning, physical labour experience, and exact timing, yet it arrived with no explanation of any of those things. A child simply reached for it. Some ate the roll before the tray reached the table. Some saved it to wipe away the final streak of gravy. Some remember it more warmly than the school building itself. Once the last crumb was gone, however, the tray still carried the foods adults expected children to eat. In the next lunchroom memory, the bread would give way to the vegetable compartment, where canned green beans, corn and peas waited with admirable patience for children who were equally determined not to notice them. The vegetable compartment was rarely empty, even when the child facing it wished otherwise. Canned green beans arrived in a small green pile, softer and darker than the beans growing in a summer garden. Their colour leaned toward olive, their edges had lost any crispness they might once have possessed, and a little cooking liquid often gathered beneath them. In some school kitchens, onion, bacon, ham, or another seasoning added flavour. In others, the beans tasted mainly of salt warmth, and the metal pan in which they had waited. A cafeteria worker measured them with the same dependable scoop used for every tray, placing the serving beside meatloaf Salisbury steak, or a sandwich that seemed far more deserving of attention. Children understood that the beans were not optional merely because they occupied the smallest compartment. Their presence completed the official meal. Whether they completed the child's idea of lunch was another matter. Canned vegetables made practical sense in a school system feeding hundreds of students through changing seasons. The cans could be stored for long periods, ordered in predictable quantities, opened when needed, and heated without the cleaning, trimming, and short shelf life required by fresh produce. This did not mean every district used the same products or followed the same purchasing system. Some schools obtained particular foods through federal commodity channels, while others bought them through local contracts or suppliers. Frozen vegetables were also becoming increasingly useful where storage and equipment allowed. Yet canned green beans remained a familiar institutional food because they were dependable. The kitchen knew approximately how many servings a case could provide. The beans would not suddenly spoil before Tuesday's lunch. They could wait on the steam table while one class after another entered. Their greatest weakness was the same quality that made them so cooperative After enough heat and waiting, they offered almost no resistance at all. At the table, children developed strategies that had little to do with nutrition and much to do with escape. One student ate the beans, first removing the unpleasant duty before touching the hamburger. Another saved them until the end, hoping the bell would become an official pardon. Some cut the beans into smaller pieces as though reducing their size also reduced the required amount. Others mixed them into mashed potatoes or covered them with gravy, allowing a more popular food to carry them past inspection. A warm roll could hide one or two, although bread was generally considered too valuable for that assignment. The lunch duty teacher might remind the table to stop playing with food, but moving green beans from one side of a compartment to the other could look remarkably similar to serious eating when performed slowly enough. By the end of lunch, the beans were often colder flatter, and arranged with greater care than when they had arrived. Corn entered the tray with a brighter reputation. Yellow kernels glistened beneath a light coating of butter or margarine, offering sweetness, and a colour that survived cafeteria cooking more successfully than green beans did. Corn could be canned or frozen depending on the school, and it paired easily with hamburgers, chili meatloaf turkey, and nearly anything else the menu placed beside it. A large pan could be heated, seasoned, and portioned quickly with a slotted spoon or scoop. Children who rejected many vegetables sometimes accepted corn because it tasted mild and familiar. It appeared at family suppers, summer cookouts, and holiday tables, though the cafeteria version had been removed from the cob and made fully compatible with institutional efficiency. No butter ran down the elbow. No teeth became covered with kernels in rows. The school had already completed the difficult part and presented corn in a form that required only a fork. The kernels did create one practical problem. They escaped. A fork could capture several, but one always seemed to roll toward the edge of the tray or hide beneath the entree. Some children pushed the kernels onto a spoon. Others mixed them into potatoes, chili, or macaroni and cheese, creating combinations that were never mentioned on the menu but worked surprisingly well. Corn also possessed a small trading advantage over other vegetables. A child who liked it might accept an extra serving in exchange for fruit or dessert, although such bargains depended entirely on the table and the level of adult supervision. Butter improved the flavour, but also made the kernels more difficult to control. The cafeteria had turned corn into neat individual pieces, and the pieces used that freedom immediately. Peas were even more mobile, small, round, and bright green when frozen versions were used, or softer and duller when canned. They rolled across metal and moulded trays with almost no encouragement. A child pressing too firmly with a fork could send one toward a neighbouring compartment. A spoon was better, but choosing a spoon made the vegetable seem more important than many children wished to admit. Peas appeared beside fish sticks, chicken and noodles, turkey pot pie, and casseroles where they sometimes arrived already mixed into the main dish. Mixed peas were difficult to avoid because sauce or gravy held them in place. Separate peas offered more opportunity. They could be eaten one by one, gathered into potatoes, pushed beneath a roll, or arranged in lines while a teacher watched another table. Their round shape made them useful for activities the cafeteria had not approved. The expectation that children eat their vegetables reflected both school meal planning and broader family rules of the period. Many children heard some version of "take a bite, clean your plate," or there are children who would be grateful for that food. Those expectations varied among families and schools, and enforcement ranged from a gentle reminder to a prolonged contest between child vegetable and adult authority. The vegetable compartment represented nourishment economy, an official balance to the people planning the menu. To the child it could feel like a final examination attached to lunch. Yet not every memory is negative. Some students liked green beans seasoned by an experienced cafeteria cook. Others remember sweet corn as the best side on the tray, or peas mixed into potatoes with genuine affection. Taste depended on recipe timing, local ingredients, and the standards formed at home. Green beans, corn, and peas were small foods carrying large responsibilities. They had to provide colour, complete the meal pattern, remain affordable, survive storage, tolerate institutional cooking, and persuade children who had already given their loyalty to rolls, gravy, and dessert. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they returned to the washing area almost untouched, arranged in suspiciously tidy piles. Their presence on the tray reveals how school lunch was designed not merely around what children wanted, but around what adults believed a complete meal should contain. Once the vegetable compartment had been accepted, avoided, traded, or concealed, attention could move toward the sweeter side of lunch. There, beneath a shallow pool of syrup fruit cocktail weighted with pear cubes, peaches, pineapple, pale grapes, and one red cherry, valuable enough to change the economy of an entire table, fruit cocktail arrived in a shallow tray compartment beneath a clear sweet syrup that caught the cafeteria lights. The serving contained small cubes of pear and peach-pale pieces of pineapple soft grapes, and perhaps a fragment of something that could no longer be identified with confidence. Yet one piece required no investigation. The red cherry announced itself immediately. Bright against the cream-coloured fruit, it looked rarer, sweeter, and far more important than its size justified. Some portions contained one. Others seemed to have missed the cherry entirely during the journey from can to serving pan. Children noticed the difference before the tray reached the table. A student who received the red piece had acquired an asset. A student who did not might begin negotiations before opening the milk carton. The cafeteria considered fruit cocktail one measured serving. The lunch table understood that the cherry and everything surrounding it belonged to separate economic systems. Canned fruit worked well for schools because it could be stored, ordered, opened, chilled, and portioned throughout the year, without depending entirely on the short season of a fresh crop. Large institutional cans held enough fruit for many trays, while the syrup helped preserve texture and sweetness. A worker opened the cans, poured the contents into deep pans or containers, and used a ladle or perforated scoop to divide the mixture. The task looked simple until fairness entered the process. Fruit pieces settled unevenly, grapes and heavier cubes gathered in one place, syrup collected in another, and the cherries appeared so infrequently that no serving method could guarantee one for every child. Stir too little, and the first scoops contained mostly syrup. Stir too firmly, and soft pears and peaches began losing their square edges. The lunch staff had to distribute a product whose ingredients had never agreed to appear in equal numbers. The syrup created its own memory. It was cool when the fruit was improperly chilled, slightly warm when the pan had waited too long near the serving line, and sweet enough to remain on the spoon after the solid pieces were gone. A tilted tray sent it toward neighbouring compartments where it could reach a roll green beans or the bottom edge of a sandwich. Children learned to carry fruit cocktail carefully, because peach syrup on a hamburger bun produced a combination no menu committee had intended. At the table, some ate the fruit first before the syrup escaped. Others saved it as dessert even when the official menu classified it as the fruit portion of the meal. A few drank the remaining liquid from the compartment with a spoon, or by lifting the tray more directly than lunchroom manners allowed. The sound of metal against metal grew louder as children chased the last grape around the shallow space. The cherry controlled the trading market. A child who disliked canned pears might still defend the entire serving until the red piece had been eaten. Another removed the cherry immediately and placed it safely beside the roll, protecting it from accidental syrup loss or an ambitious neighbour. Trades varied according to local taste. One cherry might be exchanged for a cookie, a spoonful of corn, half a peanut butter sandwich, or the promise of future cooperation on pizza day. Adults discouraged food trading for practical reasons, but children continued to calculate value whenever supervision turned elsewhere. The red piece was scarce visible and easy to transfer, which gave it advantages unavailable to mashed potatoes. Its flavour was often less natural than its colour suggested, yet that hardly mattered. Childhood value did not always follow culinary quality. A tiny cherry could make a serving feel lucky, and the absence of one could turn an otherwise identical tray into evidence of injustice. Fruit cocktail also carried memories from beyond school. Families served it from glass bowls, spooned it over cottage cheese, folded it into gelatin, or brought it to picnics and church suppers as part of a larger dessert. A can in the pantry offered dependable fruit, when fresh choices were limited, expensive, out of season, or unlikely to survive a week of family meals. Some households saved fruit cocktail for company, while others treated it as an ordinary side beside sandwiches or casseroles. The cafeteria version therefore felt familiar to many children, though family habits differed widely. One student knew a chilled bowl with plenty of cherries added at home. Another knew canned peaches but had never seen mixed fruit until school. A third came from a household where fresh home-canned or culturally specific fruit dishes were more common. The little tray compartment gathered those different backgrounds together without explaining any of them. The mixture revealed how strongly appearance shaped memory. Pears, peaches, pineapple, and grapes all offered sweetness, but the cherry supplied colour and suspense. Children watched the serving spoon, compared portions, and understood immediately who had received the best visual arrangement. The same instinct appeared when one meatloaf slice looked larger, or one roll carried a darker top. School lunch was planned through portions, nutrients, cost, and available ingredients. Children judged it through luck. The best tray had the centerpiece of pizza, the warmest roll, the largest spoonful of gravy, and the fruit cocktail with the red cherry resting clearly on top. No federal guideline could measure that form of satisfaction. By the end of lunch, the syrup had thinned across the compartment. A pear cube might remain near the edge, and the cherry was long gone. The fruit cocktail was rarely the loudest item on the menu, but it left a precise memory: the metallic sound of the spoon, the cool sweetness of canned peach, the pale grape that slipped away twice, and the single flash of red worth bargaining for. It represented the cafeteria's effort to provide fruit in a form that was affordable, available, and predictable throughout the school year. It also showed how children could turn one ordinary canned product into a game of scarcity, fairness, and trade. On the next tray, the fruit would no longer rest loosely in syrup. It would be suspended inside a trembling square of coloured gelatin, where the cafeteria would ask an even more difficult question: was this supposed to be salad, fruit, or dessert? The gelatin square arrived with perfect edges and uncertain purpose. It might be red, orange, green, or yellow, trembling slightly each time the tray moved and reflecting the cafeteria lights with a shine no green bean could achieve. Inside were pieces of canned fruit suspended at different depths, a pale pear cube near the bottom, a fragment of pineapple halfway through, perhaps a grape or peach piece held near the surface, as though the gelatin had stopped time. The cafeteria worker lifted each portion with a flat utensil and placed it carefully into a small compartment where it continued to quiver after everything else had become still. Children recognized it as something sweet, but the menu did not always make its role clear. Was it fruit? Was it salad? Was it dessert? The gelatin offered no answer. It simply waited beside the entree with the confidence of a food that had been assigned a category somewhere in an office. For a school kitchen, gelatin had several useful qualities. The powdered mixture could be dissolved in hot water, combined with cold liquid poured into wide pans and prepared well before lunch. Once chilled, it could be cut into regular squares that gave each tray a similar portion. Canned fruit added colour sweetness and the appearance of variety throughout the school year, even when fresh fruit choices were limited by season price storage or local supply. The cook still had to plan carefully. The gelatin needed enough time to set the fruit had to remain distributed rather than sinking into one crowded layer, and the pans required refrigerator space that other foods also wanted. Too much fruit or extra syrup could weaken the structure. Too little produced a clear block with one lonely pear cube trapped inside. Convenience existed, but only after someone had opened the cans, measured the water carried the heavy pans, and found a cold shelf large enough to hold them. The fruit introduced practical complications of its own. Canned pineapple could interfere with setting if the kitchen handled ingredients or proportions poorly, while soft pears and peaches could tear when portions were cut. Grapes rolled away from the knife. Fruit pieces gathered near the edges of the pan, giving some children generous squares and others little more than coloured gelatin. A cafeteria worker could not examine every serving for fairness while the lunch line waited. One square landed on the tray containing 3 visible pieces of fruit. The next held a single pale fragment suspended near the bottom. Children noticed immediately. As with fruit cocktail, the official serving size mattered less than what could be seen. A bright cherry piece, when one appeared, raised the value of the portion considerably. A square containing no recognizable fruit might still taste sweet, but it lacked evidence that the cafeteria had fulfilled the promise. At the table, gelatin behaved unlike anything else on the tray. A fork pressed into it and the square moved away before surrendering a bite. A spoon worked better, though. Using one required finding it before the gelatin escaped toward the vegetable compartment. Some children cut the square into smaller cubes and watched them shake separately. Others pressed down with the fork to see how far the dessert could flatten before springing back. The lunch duty teacher generally recognized this as playing with food, even when the child described it as an experiment. The texture divided opinion. To one student it was cool, sweet and refreshing after meatloaf or chili. To another it felt too smooth, too slippery and suspiciously capable of moving without assistance. The canned fruit pieces created sudden interruptions, changing one soft bite into a chewable one without warning. The confusion over whether gelatin belonged to salad or dessert was not limited to schools. Across many mid-century American homes, recipe booklets, magazines, church suppers and family gatherings used gelatin in dishes that could contain fruit cottage cheese, whipped toppings, vegetables, nuts, or ingredients that modern diners might not expect to meet inside anything transparent. Some versions were clearly sweet. Others were called salads because they appeared beside the main course rather than after it. School cafeterias adopted simpler preparations, often combining flavoured gelatin with canned fruit and allowing the menu planner to place it wherever the meal needed colour and sweetness. Children were less interested in classification than in consequences. If the gelatin counted as fruit, would there still be a cookie? If it counted as dessert, why was it touching the peas? These were serious questions, and the printed menu rarely offered useful legal guidance. The appeal of the dish also depended on temperature. Properly chilled gelatin felt cool against the spoon and held a clean square shape. After waiting too long on a warm serving line, the edges softened and a thin layer of liquid appeared around the base. The square still trembled, but now with less confidence. In a crowded lunchroom it could slide when the tray tilted, leaving a coloured trail that reached the bread or potatoes. A child who saved it until the end risked discovering that dessert had become syrup at the corners. Those who ate it first protected the texture but violated the common instinct to save sweetness for last. The gelatin therefore created a small scheduling problem inside an already short lunch period. Eat it now, and the entree cooled. Wait, and the square slowly surrendered to the room. Many former students remember gelatin with affection because it added colour to trays dominated by brown gravy, pale potatoes, and olive green vegetables. Others remember it mainly as a compulsory object that could not decide what it wanted to be. Both memories are reasonable. The dish represented the cafeteria's preference for foods that could be made ahead, divided evenly, stored safely, and served quickly. It also reflected a wider period when moulded and chilled foods carried a sense of order, modernity, and occasion. A plain bowl of canned fruit became more deliberate once held inside a shining square. The presentation suggested control, even if one grape had settled near the bottom and the entire serving wobbled whenever someone laughed at the table. By the end of lunch, the gelatin had been eaten, traded, rearranged, or left in a bright puddle beside the spoon. Its flavour may have been strawberry, orange, lime, lemon, or something remembered only as red or green, but the physical memory remained exact: the cool square, the trapped fruit, the fork that pushed it away, and the question of whether dessert had arrived early. The next sweet cafeteria memory would be less uncertain. Apple crisp came from the oven in deep pans, carrying warm cinnamon through the hallway and placing soft fruit beneath a browned crumb topping. It did not tremble, it did not slide, and no child needed a menu committee to explain what it was. Apple crisp changed the smell of the school before most children saw the tray. Cinnamon, warm apples, brown sugar, and baked crumbs drifted from the cafeteria into the hallway, reaching classrooms where students were supposed to be concentrating on handwriting or long division. The aroma was sweeter than the usual mixture of gravy-cooked vegetables and floor cleaner, and it carried a promise that lunch would end well, even if the main course did not. Behind the serving counter, deep rectangular pans held softened apples beneath a rough golden-brown topping. A cafeteria worker cut or scooped each portion into the dessert compartment, sometimes keeping the layers together, and sometimes producing a mixture of fruit syrup and crumbs. Unlike the gelatin square apple, crisp did not wobble or slide away from the fork. It rested warmly on the tray, unmistakably a dessert, although its position beside meatloaf or bean soup meant the child still had to decide whether rules required saving it until the end. The apples used in a school kitchen depended on season, location, purchasing arrangements, and the amount of preparation the staff could manage. Some cafeterias may have worked with fresh apples that needed washing, peeling, coring, and slicing. Others relied on canned or prepared fruit that offered greater consistency and saved labour. Either method had to produce enough filling for large pans and several lunch periods. The fruit was combined with sugar cinnamon, and sometimes a thickener or a little liquid to keep the dessert moist during baking. Above it went a crumbly mixture that might include flour, oats, brown sugar, butter, margarine, or another fat according to the recipe. At home, a cook could adjust the topping by feel and add another handful of cinnamon when nobody was measuring. At school, quantity recipes and standardized pans helped ensure that the first table and the last received something reasonably similar. Reasonably, as always, left room for debate. The topping created the most valuable difference between portions. A corner serving could carry a dark, crisp edge where sugar and fruit juice had baked against the pan. A center scoop might contain softer crumbs and more apples. Some children wanted the brown topping and only enough fruit to support it. Others preferred the warm apple filling and left dry crumbs behind. The serving utensil could not satisfy everyone. It pressed through the crust, lifted the fruit beneath, and occasionally left the best browned section attached to the pan. The worker had no time to negotiate with each child over corner pieces. A line-weighted milk cartons needed moving, and the next pan had to be brought forward. Still, students watched the scoop carefully. One tray received a generous cap of crumbs. The next appeared to contain mostly apples. As with the red cherry in Fruit Cocktail Cafeteria, fairness could be judged by details no official portion chart had considered. At the table, apple crisp behaved differently according to temperature. Fresh from the oven, the filling could be hot enough to punish the first enthusiastic bite. Steam rose when the spoon opened the center, carrying cinnamon directly toward the face. The apples were soft but still recognizable, and the topping retained some crunch. After waiting, the fruit cooled, the juices thickened, and the crumbs absorbed moisture from below. By the later lunch periods, the dessert might be more tender than crisp, but the name remained. Children learned to test the edge with a spoon, or wait while eating the main course. Those who saved dessert until last risked losing the warm contrast that made it special. Those who ate it first faced adult disapproval, or at least the raised eyebrow of a lunch duty teacher. Apple crisp therefore created a small moral question. Was dessert order more important than dessert temperature? The dish also connected the cafeteria to home kitchens, autumn tables, and community suppers. Many families made some form of baked apple dessert because apples could be familiar, economical, and easier to handle than a pie requiring a carefully rolled crust. A crisp or crumble accepted imperfect slices, different varieties, and a topping spread quickly by hand. It could be baked in one pan, carried to a gathering, and served with a spoon rather than cut into flawless wedges. Some children knew versions made by a mother-grandmother, neighbour, or church cook. Others encountered the dessert mainly at school. The cafeteria interpretation might be sweeter, softer, or more heavily thickened than the one at home, but the cinnamon smell could cross those differences. It suggested an ordinary American kitchen even when the actual pan was large enough to feed an entire classroom. Preparing the dessert at institutional scale required labour that disappeared beneath the crumbs. Apples or cans had to be opened and handled, dry ingredients measured topping. Mixed pans, filled ovens timed, and hot trays moved safely onto racks. Sugar that spilled had to be cleaned before it hardened. Fruit juice baked onto the pan edges and waited stubbornly for the washing area. The dessert could be prepared ahead, but it still had to reach lunch warm without losing all its texture. Cafeteria workers balanced that task beside the main meal, vegetables, bread, milk service, and the endless count of how many children remained. An advertisement might have presented baked apple dessert as effortless comfort. The school kitchen knew that comfort came in heavy pans and left behind a serious cleaning assignment. Apple crisp earned its place in memory because it transformed the entire room before the first spoonful. A hamburger could be seen, and gravy could be tasted, but cinnamon travelled. It slipped beneath cafeteria doors and announced lunch to children still sitting at desks. The smell made the school feel briefly less institutional, as though someone had opened a family oven behind the serving line. Even students who disliked cooked fruit could appreciate the topping, and even a modest portion offered a warm ending after canned vegetables or a difficult entree. The dessert was simple, but the effect was generous. It gave the tray colour sweetness, and the feeling that someone had planned beyond basic fullness. When the pans were empty, crumbs remained in the corners and cinnamon lingered in the hallway through the afternoon. Children returned to class carrying no visible evidence except perhaps one brown sugar spot on a sleeve, but the smell stayed attached to the memory. Apple crisp showed how a school dessert could turn inexpensive ingredients into something that felt homemade, seasonal, and worth anticipating. The final lunch on this list would preserve an even more specific regional memory. It came as a dense square of peanut butter, sometimes iced, sometimes paired with chocolate, and remembered so clearly that former students would spend years searching for the cafeteria recipe. The peanut butter bar arrived as a small square with a large reputation. In schools where it appeared the dessert might have a dense, chewy base, a softer cookie-like centre, or a thin layer of frosting spread across the top. Some versions paired peanut butter with chocolate, while others allowed the roasted salty sweetness to stand alone beneath a pale glaze. The edges were usually firmer than the center, making a corner piece especially desirable, and the bar could leave a faint oily mark on the waxed paper or tray beneath it. After soup, gravy, vegetables, and milk, that small square offered a concentrated final bite. Children who had spent lunch carefully avoiding peas suddenly became remarkably efficient. The bar was eaten slowly by those who wanted the sweetness to last, and quickly by those who feared that a classmate might propose a trade too tempting to refuse. Its exact form depended heavily on the school. One district remembered a thick peanut butter cookie cut into rectangles. Another recalled an oatmeal base covered with peanut butter icing. Elsewhere, chocolate frosting or a chocolate layer created a dessert closer to a homemade candy bar. Some cafeterias may have served peanut butter cookies more often than bars, and many of the recipes now shared under the name school lunch peanut butter bars come from later decades, or from personal attempts to reconstruct an older memory. That uncertainty is part of the story. Unlike a nationally packaged product, with a printed ingredient list, a cafeteria dessert often lived inside one local kitchen. The recipe might have been typed onto a district card, copied into a notebook, adjusted by an experienced cook, and passed from one employee to another without ever becoming a single American standard. Two neighbouring towns could use the same name for desserts that looked and tasted noticeably different. Behind the serving counter, the bar offered the practical advantages of sheet pan baking. A thick batter or dough could be mixed in quantity, spread across broad pans, baked cooled, and cut into rows. The kitchen did not need to shape hundreds of individual cookies unless the recipe required it. Straight cuts helped workers estimate the number of servings, although the final row always raised the question of whether the pieces would remain equal. Peanut butter provided a strong flavour that survived quantity preparation, while sugar, flour, fat, oats, eggs, or other ingredients varied with the formula. Frosting added another layer of work. It had to be mix-spread when the bars were cool enough, and allowed to set before cutting. If the pan was sliced too soon, the topping dragged behind the knife. If it waited too long, the edges became firm enough to challenge the serving spatula. Convenience once again depended on somebody arriving early and lifting heavy pans. At the lunch table, the dessert entered an established economy. A child who disliked the main course could still judge the entire meal successful if a peanut butter bar waited in the final compartment. Another might trade canned fruit, a roll, or part of a sandwich for a second piece. The bar was compact, easy to transfer, and far less likely than gelatin to escape during negotiations. Its smell was familiar from peanut butter sandwiches packed at home, but its texture made it feel more special. The surface might crack lightly beneath the teeth. The center could remain soft and slightly sticky. Chocolate frosting, when present, left a dark line on the fingers and made the milk carton suddenly more useful. The dessert required no spoon, no careful dipping, and no argument over whether it counted as salad. It knew exactly what it was. Today, people searching for the remembered recipe often discover that memory has preserved sensations more clearly than measurements. They remember the thickness of the square, the colour of the frosting, and whether oats could be seen along the broken edge. They remember the cafeteria worker who cut the pieces larger on certain days, the tray from which the last corner disappeared, and the way peanut butter lingered after the milk was gone. But one former student insists the bar was covered in chocolate, while another from the same state remembers no chocolate at all. A recipe offered online may taste close but not exact, because it lacks the institutional pan, the particular brand of ingredients, the school oven, or the hands of the person who made it. It also lacks the room. Memory has mixed the dessert with fluorescent lights, metal utensils, friends calling across the table, and the bell that always rang before anyone felt finished. That is why old cafeteria recipes can survive even when the original cards disappear. Retired cooks write them from memory. Families copy them into community collections. Former students ask school districts whether anyone saved the formula. A handwritten card may surface with stains near the corner and quantities large enough to feed 100 children, forcing the home baker to divide everything into a more reasonable pan. Yet caution remains necessary. A cherished recipe may belong to the 1970s rather than the 1960s, or it may have continued across several decades until everyone associates it with a different school year. The safest claim is not that every 1960s child ate the same peanut butter bar. It is that certain cafeteria desserts became so closely tied to particular schools and communities that the search for them continued long after the lunchrooms had changed. The peanut butter bar closes this list because it reveals what school lunch memory preserves best. Not official meal patterns, purchasing contracts, or the number of portions prepared, although all of those shape the tray. Memory keeps the physical details, the milk carton that would not open properly, the roll warm enough to soften butter the gravy, well in the mashed potatoes, the cherry in the fruit cocktail, and the dessert square saved until the end. It also keeps the work that children rarely saw. Cafeteria employees stirred kettles, shaped dough, opened cans, lifted pans, counted portions, served long lines, and cleaned the trays after the room emptied. The meal could be simple, but the labour behind it was not. Not every child remembers these 30 foods, and no single cafeteria served them all in exactly the same way. Menus change by region, district, budget, season, kitchen equipment, and year. Some children bought hot lunch every day. Others open metal lunchboxes filled at home. Some remember school food as comfort, some as an ordeal, and many remember the same dish with both affection and disbelief. The 1960s cafeteria was never one universal room, but its repeated objects became part of a shared American language. The divided tray, the serving scoop, the wire milk crate, the steam table, and the long folding tables where children learned that one red cherry could be valuable, and one pea could roll an astonishing distance. When lunch ended, the trays returned to the washing area and the children went back to class. The smell of apple crisp or yeast rolls remained in the hallway, while a spot of tomato sauce or peanut butter frosting travelled home on a sleeve. Many of the meals changed in later decades. Scratch baking declined in numerous districts, prepared foods became more standardized, nutritional rules evolved, and regional recipes lost some of their place. Other dishes survived under new names or in altered forms, but the memories stayed attached to the people, rooms, and routines around them. Somewhere in an old recipe box, a card may still hold the proportions for the peanut butter bars. Somewhere else, a former student needs no recipe at all. One imagined bite is enough to hear the lunch bell again.